I'm here to talk about transparency and the way transparency can change the food system. So I'm going to do that by telling a story, and that story begins in 1999 in California. And that year, an environmental group issued a report that showed Latino kids were being disproportionately exposed to pesticides. That's because they attended schools in areas that were right next to fields that were being sprayed. And these were mostly fumigants, which require a full body hazmat suit to apply, and that those fumigants were drifting over the schools. Now, another advocacy group thought that might be a good subject for a lawsuit. So they found parents whose kids attended these schools, and they filed a complaint against the EPA. Now, why the EPA? This was California. It's because the EPA funded the state's Department of Pesticide regulation. And under the Civil Rights Act, the EPA has to make sure that its funding is not discriminatory. And the plaintiffs thought if Latino kids were being disproportionately exposed, it was a good subject for a civil rights complaint. Now that suit, that complaint wound its way through the courts for more than a dozen years. And in fact, aspects of that suit are continuing to this day. But the story doesn't end there. A couple of years ago, a reporter came to us at the Food and Environment Reporting Network with a really interesting project. She wanted to map pesticide use data with zip codes to find out who was facing the most exposure. Now, she thought the Central Valley of California might have the highest rates. The problem, though, is that this kind of correlation is really tricky because pesticide use data that's reported by the state doesn't conform to zip code maps. So she found a researcher at UC Davis, and they worked together at cleaning up the data and transposing it over a zip code map so that she could see who was getting the most exposure. So the first thing that she found was pretty surprising. It wasn't the Central Valley where people were getting the most exposure rates. It was actually north of Los Angeles in Ventura County, centered around a town called Oxnard. And this is an area that produces 630 million pounds of strawberries annually, often with a cocktail of pesticides. She took that data, and she also found something else that was surprising. When she looked at the characteristics of the census data underlying these maps, underlying these zip code maps, she found that these communities were predominantly Latino. And I'm not talking about 30% Latino or 40% Latino. These communities were 70% Latino, 80% Latino. And when she began reporting out the story, visiting the schools, talking to teachers, talking to students, she also found out about this lawsuit that had been going on for more than a dozen years. Now, at the same time, another investigative news organization, the Center for Investigative Reporting, was doing a story on a related topic. And it's about how a chemical company was lobbying the state of California for a special exemption to a highly toxic pesticide. They won the exemption, and use rates of that pesticide went up dramatically in areas like Ventura County. Now, within a few months after our stories appeared, our reporter, her name is Liza Gross, was called to Sacramento to appear before, to address lawmakers. And shortly after that, the Department of Pesticide Regulation started holding hearings around the state about the use of pesticides near schools. And the upshot of that was that California recently proposed new regulations that would increase the buffer zones between fields that were being sprayed and schools, and also limit the time when those sprays could be used. So obviously, lawsuits have their place. Courts can have a big role modifying practices, but so too can transparency, so too can media. And we found it in this case, and we found it in many others over the past 5 years. But I feel like our work has only just begun, and it's really going to change in the 4 years to come. Thank you.